Welcome to May's Tea Break, where we are talking about who people attend with in various forms. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, possibly familiar to some of you if you've been to a tea break before. And I am a white male with blonde hair and with various sort of postcards and stuff behind me, a black t-shirt. And I'm joined for this session by our very brilliant colleague, Jacqui Fortnum. If you want to say a quick hello, Jacqui.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Jacqui. I'm a senior consultant at the Audience Agency. I am a white woman and I have white hair.
Oh, yes, it's changed. Fab. So today there's really a couple of different things that relate to groups or group bookings or who people attend with that I thought would be interesting to discuss. But I do very much want to hear your opinions about some of these things because I think there's some interesting and curious things going on that would be good to get your perspectives on. So, as they say, without more ado. The first thing is I was doing a bit of delving in our audience answers data, so our kind of ticketing transaction data a little while back, and noticed something quite curious. So we've looked quite a lot about sort of which types of people are attending, how that's changed over time and so forth. But in particular, I noticed something odd about party size. And it's something I've been sort of mulling on. We've not had a chance to bring back for a bit. So this is a bit of a chance to explore it. It also relates to some other work I've been doing. I've literally last night just sent a draft report to Arts Council England for a project we've been doing about touring. And some of the things part of the conversation on that project involved, oh, my sound's a bit weird apparently. Is anyone else finding it a bit weird? I probably ought to phrase that more carefully. Jacqui, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, okay. Sounds okay for me.
Okay, I shall carry on and just hope that it's but thank you everyone for chipping in. So as part of that touring project, we had lots of conversations with lots of people about things that were affecting touring and touring audiences at the moment. And one of the things that came up repeatedly was the idea that schools audiences were down for a variety of reasons. We'll talk more about that in a sec. And so it got me thinking, actually, let's talk about this a bit more. So here is the sort of the first summary picture, which is looking at the overall ticket sales in audience answers for a standard set of venues, 255, strange number, it just so happens to be the ones that we've got comparative data on, looking at 24-25 ticket sales compared to 19-20. Now, the first thing is good news. For the first time in years, we've seen those numbers actually now being higher than they were pre-pandemic. So that's something. But notably, they aren't higher for large groups. They're down a bit for transactions of 7 to 12, 7%, but they're down really quite a lot for transactions of 12 or more tickets purchased at once. I should say this excludes comps. So it is literally purchase tickets, but you see the large groups down really quite a lot. And we'll see the extent to which that matters, but also who it matters for. First, there are, I think, speaking, 3 different types of large group. There's school trips that we've touched on. There's organised groups, and there are sort of social groups, people sort of going with friends. Now, school groups, we won't have in the data that I'm about to talk about because this is for people who we have audience spectrum profiles for, and schools don't have audience spectrum profiles because they're not people. But we have heard lots about various different things which are driving school trips being lower. So cost budgets for schools, but also budgets for parents. So schools not wanting to put the burden onto parents of saying there's a school trip. So that's been happening quite a bit. Changes the curriculum, the extent to which people are doing art subjects, and particularly kind of specialist arts related subjects like drama, but also the prioritization of sort of key performance measures for the school, which are more about literacy and numeracy and so forth, than about the wider curriculum, risk assessments, cost of transport, a whole load of things which are driving school trips down. I would be interested to hear from some of you about the extent to which you've seen that as a factor. But we've certainly anecdotally, we've heard it across the board, and it does seem to be quite a big thing. But what we're talking about will be more about organised and informal groups on these bits. It varies by who. So there's a whole load of slightly stripy or brightly coloured charts coming up, but in essence, what this is showing is along the bottom, it's the different sizes of transactions. So it was a single ticket bought at once, was it 2 tickets, 3 tickets, 4 tickets, and so on. And the proportion of all those bookings that were made by different audience spectrum groups. So they're color-coded, highly engaged groups in orange, mustardy-ish for the middle engaged groups, and blue-ish for the lower engaged groups. And the 2 biggest groups are the 2 highest groups, and that's unsurprising. But notably, they go up in terms of proportion for bigger transactions. So dormitory dependables, commuter land culture buffs, sort of middle-ish England and or affluent, on average a little bit older, particularly the commuter land culture buffs, tendency to buy sort of big ticket type things, but also obviously to go in groups, we can see here. They become increasingly prominent. If we look at just single ticket buyers, metroculturals and experience seekers almost have as many transactions, but that changes really quite rapidly once you get into the higher number of transactions. So when we talk about those higher transactions being down, it's connected to some of these groups also being down. So commuter land culture buffs, highly engaged group, been really important for lots of venues, more traditional tastes, and we have seen them being a sort of like a softer segment in terms of response in recent times compared to previously. And that obviously then plays through into large groups. We also see, if we look at sort of this middle line, sort of the slightly dashed line zipping through the middle, that home and heritage, which is the group we've seen drop most, is a relatively high proportion of single tickets, but also really large group tickets. They don't tend to be sort of somewhere in between. They do kind of spike at the large group end, which sounds a bit like coach trips, because they tend to be older, more rural, possibly more traditional in their taste, etc. So there could be a sort of a coach trip thing going on there. But again, because that group is really important for the large groups, how that group is behaving becomes quite important, and that group are really quite down. So this then is showing how each of these segment and size of booking pictures have changed. So anything over 100 means it's grown since 2019-20. Anything below 100 means that it's shrunk, relatively speaking. But the clear thing we can see is that there's a tendency for it to have shrunk the further you get towards large bookings. Now that fits with the overall picture where we saw that things were up in general, but down for the large bookings. So that's all consistent. But it also, we can see that some segments are particularly strongly affected. So metroculturals are have dropped particularly steeply when we get to the really large groups. Home and heritage are down for everything. They're down the most, the large groups, and so forth. So we can see there is a kind of a real kind of pivot point when we get above 7 to 12 tickets where everything's down quite sharply for all groups. However, just to put this in a little bit of context, we have to bear in mind that there are many more 2-ticket transactions than there are big transactions. So actually the changes in absolute numbers are highest for the sort of pairs of tickets. And there's something really interesting to my mind about the way that the middle engaged groups have really split in terms of their behaviour compared to 5 years ago. So a couple of them are substantially up, sort of 200,000 tickets up across these 200 venues. But then one of them, Home and Heritage, is then the equivalent distance down. So that's sort of a real kind of shift going on there. But what we can see, if we look out towards the right of this chart, is that pretty much everything is below the line. Most of the segments, most groups are down, but particularly community land culture buffs and Home and Heritage. So older, more rural, much less likely to be attending in large groups. Specifically, when we look at actually literally how many tickets, does that mean that it's have decreased by? We've got really big drops for these two segments. So if we think that large groups dropping is a significant issue, it's about these people in particular, essentially. What's going on there? So a piece of context, which I think doesn't directly explain this, but is maybe useful to have in mind, is in the Cultural Participation Monitor, so in our big survey of people's attitudes across the public, we asked people whether they had more or fewer people to attend cultural events with than they used to. So do you agree more with the statement I have more people and different people to attend with, or I can attend with more, or fewer people, less people can attend with them less? Which do you agree with? And we saw, on average, quite a lot of people were saying it splits either way, but on balance, there's a slightly more of the likely to be attending less, but it differed by segment. So what we saw was metroculturals and experience seekers, urban, highly engaged, etc., relatively likely to say that they have more people to engage with. So there's a greater kind of activity in terms of engagement there. But of each of the groups of segments, in terms of high engaged or medium engaged, the ones that were least likely to say that they had more people to attend with are these groups, or we're seeing them not attending in really large groups. Now, that there may not be a direct link between these kind of large group trips and general kind of people to engage with, but I think there's maybe something going on there. We're also seeing that score tends to be lower for older people. So some of the older segments are all a bit down. So that's the first piece of the picture. So we're seeing, generally speaking, across most transaction sizes, things are up. The largest transaction size is much substantially down, so down 37%, I think it was, for the largest group. We're seeing there's a particular preponderance of community land culture buffs and home and heritage within that group that have dropped, and that's a kind of a trend that we might want to think about in terms of its kind of implications, what we can do about it. Do we need to do anything about it? But certainly it seems to be something that has shifted, and that's a kind of social context that might be helpful for getting certain people to engage, potentially. So that's question number one. Question number two is a whole slightly stranger thing, I think, is the mysteriously entitled shadow audiences, which is, as I said to Jacqui earlier, it's maybe less exciting and exotic than it sounds from that kind of mysterious title, but it's about the people who you don't have information about because they're not the booker. So this obviously applies to sort of ticketed venues rather than others, but you collect data in the box office from whoever the purchaser was. They buy X number of tickets, and you know about one of those people, which is the purchaser. So you end up with a whole load of people lurking behind in the shadows as an unknown audience. This is something I chatted about a bit at the Ticketing Professionals Conference a few weeks back, alongside colleagues from True Tickets and Baker Richards. And in fact, we're doing another little session in a couple of weeks' time. If you're intrigued by this topic, talking about it more generally, how you can why you want to do things about it, how you could do something about it. And there's some very sort of technical solutions in terms of ticketing systems where you can allocate tickets to individual named people, so they're not therefore anonymous people anymore. But I particularly wanted just to pick up on it in terms of group bookers and why it might particularly matter in terms of those groups. So, so we've got our different size of ticketing transactions that we've talked about previously, and they make up a certain amount of all the ticketing sales. And this is the 2019 figures. There are equivalent figures we have for more recently, but essentially it's roughly speaking those kind of proportions of you typically get. People are most likely to book pairs of tickets at a time. Of course they are, but you do get some that are smaller and larger. But worth noting that actually once you get above 12, because that's obviously there's a whole load of different numbers of tickets you could have above 12, they add up to a reasonably substantial proportion. That's 1 in 7 tickets. So it's like it's a real issue, I think. If that's the number of tickets they form, the number of bookings obviously changes based on how many tickets are on a booking. You end up with many more, relatively speaking, single ticket bookings because there's only one ticket in them. You end up relatively few large ticket bookings because although they add up to a lot of tickets, they're really big bookings. So what it means is that you know about 1 out of the bookers in any given party. So if we look at that right-hand column, it means that we know who all the single ticket bookers are. We've got their details. We can link them to a postcode, link them to a spectrum segment. For pairs of tickets bought together, we know about 1 of the 2 of them, but only one. And then a third, a quarter, a fifth, and so on down the list. I've based this on the assumption there were only 7 or only 13. That's the best case scenario, really, of what you know about. You could actually know about many fewer. The net result is, sort of work it all through, given how many proportion of bookings, etc., that this means you end up having just over a third of the audience are people that you could have the knowledge of who they are. So quite a lot of the audience then is lurking in the shadows. Do we care is the question. Now, there is some research that suggests the profile overall of people who didn't buy the ticket, on average, is kind of similar to the profile of people that did buy the ticket, on average. So in that sense, if you only care about, generally speaking, who's attending, that's not sort of so much an issue. It's when you start to care about specifically who's attending, and do you want to contact them? Do you want to look at sort of social networks and how people are interacting together, that it starts to make a difference. So I was going to illustrate that second point with a little diagram. It's slightly unnerving because everyone's gone off camera. I'm assuming people are actually still here. Yes, hopefully. So let's imagine that we have 5 people who've each made, oh, thank you, Haley, who've each made 1 transaction of 2 tickets, and that's all we know about. So we just have in our box office list of 5 people, list of 5 transactions, each one's 2 tickets. We know nothing else really about these people. If we knew who they had attended with, and let's assume, for the sake of argument, that they're only attending with people in this group, thanks Nathan, then let's imagine we have this combination. So Booker A booked a ticket for themselves and Booker B. Booker B booked for themselves and Booker C. Booker C booked for themselves and Booker A. And it turns out we've got 3 people there, and they're all friends. Or at least they all attend things together. Let's assume they're friends. So that starts to tell us that there's a little bit of a social group there, and the particular things they've then bought for might relate to who that group is. And that could be quite informative. Whereas if we look at D and E, they appear to be a pair of people who are booking tickets for each other, and that's it. So to make yes, thanks, Katie. We have our own shadow audiences. So what that means is that the kind of extra information you'd get from knowing who your shadow audiences were would start telling you totally different things about the audience beyond just who they are. you'd start to see patterns in the social network. You'd also start to see how, if you like, how thick that network was, how interconnected it was. Is it kind of like a relatively loose group of people? Is it sort of a few little knots of people who are all sort of connected to each other, and does that link to parts of town or certain parts of communities, or is it people who attend certain things all tend to be the same group of people, and then other people attend lots of different things with different people? So it seems to me that there's a whole load of things about the structure of an audience that you find out if you have that extra information. Now, it is true that finding out about who the shadow audiences are is potentially a bit tricky. There are technical ways of doing it, so you can allocate all the tickets to an individual person. It's what happens at football, which is what got me thinking about this in the first place, because I suddenly realised that when I go to football, they know exactly who I'm going with every time, in a way that felt a bit strange at first, and made me realise that actually theatres don't know that, and maybe that's the strange thing. So you can do it that way. You could do separate research to find out more about what's going on. But I suppose my question to you is, does this feel like an interesting area? Does it feel like something which could be useful and helpful? How would you potentially use it if you have that information? So to recap, before passing it to Jacqui as a kind of great tangled heap of interesting things about groups, we've seen a drop in group bookers. There's different possible reasons for that. There's different types of group bookers. So I'd love to hear your views on how your group bookers are doing at different types. It is linked to social groups and spectrum segments, and we can see different groups behaving different ways. Large groups, particularly down for community land culture buffs, home and heritage. And they're down for that more than for other things, which I think is probably notable. But also, we have all these shadow bookers, and I've said a little bit about who they are and why we might want to know about them, but also that we know least about them in terms of larger groups. And does that mean we have this particular blind spot that could be quite important, because we're seeing these large groups behaving differently in ways that could be quite significant? So is it important? Would it be worth looking at? What might we want to know if we could know it? How might it change our thinking if we realise the actual shape of the audience and how many people it was? Over to Jacqui.
It was absolutely fascinating. And before I give my two penneth, I just wondered if anyone had anything they wanted to say in response, or share with us in response to those questions that Ollie was asking. Because I think with a lot of this, it very much depends on your context, whether these things are, things that you might want to investigate. Seb, yes.
Hi, I've been thinking about this for a really long time, and I'm interested to know if anybody is doing this successfully and in a way that audiences are actually giving their extra attendee data. I'm talking about the shadow attenders there. That's the sort of thing that I'm interested in, because I've never really been asked to do it myself. I'm interested in, for example, that the football seems maybe to do this well already, because I think that there are a number of very active people in our data sets who are booking for friends who we never know exist. And I think I'm one of them, actually. I always go with someone as opposed to being on someone's booking system myself.
Really interesting.
I think it's...
Where are you from? What's your venue?
I'm now at Birmingham Opera Company, but I've been at English Symphony Orchestra, Birmingham Contemporary Music Group, City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. So all kinds of organisations at different scales and different types of products, basically, and offering.
Jacqui? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in.
My initial thought was it would be interesting to hear from other ticketed organisations about whether they have investigated their shadow audiences. But what struck me is that non-ticketed organisations have had this issue for a very long time. So they necessarily don't have the sort of amount of data that ticketed organisations have. So they do have to find other ways of finding out who's attending. And it's often through surveys and things which are quite, they can be quite resource heavy to deliver. But obviously that's just something that's sort of every day for them, really. So I think it's an interesting question for ticketed organisations, whether that's a route that they would want to go down, whether it would give them enough insight and sort of actionable data that would make it worth the time it would take to conduct that additional research.
So to put a couple of things into the mix. I have heard the Roundhouse in London have been doing some work with this, because they were doing some work with True Tickets, which therefore came up with that other session. And so they have found that they can kind of track more of their audience, and that once they have the contact details of those people, they're relatively more likely on average to respond to future communications. So there's sort of an interesting benefit there. But that does remind me that there's two quite different ways of tracking the data of shadow audiences, which have really different implications. So the first one is what football does, and other sports. Yeah, other sports are available. This is partly a hooliganism thing. That they want to know exactly who's in the stadium, so everyone has to allocate every individual ticket. It also has benefits because it means you can do things like assign loyalty points to people and actually genuinely reflect what their experience is, which I think is kind of an interesting thing and has potential applications in the arts. The other way of doing it is to say you can allocate a ticket, but you don't have to. And it might be that, if you've bought a ticket for a friend and you're both turning up at the theatre, but you're coming from different places, you say, well, tell you what, I'll send you your ticket so you can get in, or you can arrive early and go and sit in the bar or something. And so there's the option to have the allocated ticket, and a bunch of people take it up, but not everyone has to. The latter is obviously a much more streamlined technical process. It's less off-putting to people. But the other one, if you can do it up front, if you can get people to create the accounts to then make it relatively quick, gives you universal coverage, which could be quite interesting. So yes, there we are. That's sort of like an interesting thing there. But Keely's asked an interesting question, which is, do you have any thoughts about first-time bookers and the idea they aren't actually first-timers at all? Yes, yes, I have very strong views about that, which you may even have heard me express in the past. I don't know. And just it was their turn to book. So yes, we so regularly have this thing where we could go, oh, someone's popped up in the database, they must be new, and they're not. For a whole variety of reasons, whether it's other people booked for them or data cleaning or all sorts of other issues. So I think this would start to help with some of that. But it also might be interesting to see what are the things that people break cover for and become the person that books. Or do people have a journey where other people book for them and then they get to the point where they then are the one that does the booking? And there's a whole load of stuff that could come out of the data, I think, if you had it. I'm sounding a bit enthusiastic. I do actually have some skepticism about it, but there we are. Anyone else have anything they want to throw in? Even just the thing about people seeing school bookings or organised groups or other groups, are you seeing those changing? Particular types of people. Tara, hi.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm sorry I didn't have my camera on earlier. I'm in Vancouver, and it's the morning.
You're still here. That's the thing.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry if I missed this because I missed the first few minutes, but I had a thought about how with the informal audiences, I've seen this in theaters and museums where it looks like smaller groups with the ticketing data. It looks like it's pairs of people coming in. It's like your shadow audiences. Like in reality, they're actually one large group. They've just split the cost. And it's something I actually had a really interesting time with a theater company where we just anecdotally noticed over a series of shows, there were lots of groups in the lobby before the show. And we were wondering, why is this happening? A lot of tickets were in singles or pairs. And they said, oh, with the community that would come to this type of show, they often all just book separately and they don't even plan it. they actually the community just knows each other so well that when they see each other at a show, then they realize they're attending together because they run into friends. And so, I mean, it's kind of two things, like maybe, yeah, I totally love investigating shadow audiences. It's very hard. But what even is that where it's like a double shadow audience or like an unknown shadow audience where people then run into people they know? I don't know. It's not common. It was a very particular community that this worked with, but I don't know. It's a thought.
But you can see how either like particular communities or people who are just super into a particular venue and art form and just know they're always in and around the building and they're bound to bump into people they know probably would feel different about just booking a single ticket turning up. Which I
Yeah,
think partly why metroculturals and experience seekers who tend to be higher engaged, tend to be more urban based and have a higher proportion booking single tickets. Because some of them will be people like I pretend that I am. I don't think I'm still in one of those segments, but I like to pretend I'm one of them. And I will just go to stuff on my own and just because I want to see it. But I think you get a bit of that behaviour and a bit of, particularly for the experience seekers, because they're a bit younger, maybe less money, then everyone pays their own because that's a kind of, not having the money up front.
that's what I've seen. Yeah, a lot of that. Families splitting, like showing up and like just because I do observation as well. And sometimes if I'm doing surveys
Yeah.
by the admissions desk, I'm like, oh, this is what's
Yeah.
happening.
But there's also a thing about like the really big groups. Is there more we could be doing to help people to convene big groups attending without thinking you need to take a deep breath and buy 12 tickets and then hope your friends are going to pay you back?
Yeah.
Or is there a sort of a way of someone saying, I want to go to this, here's a link I can send out to, I could stick my Facebook or something for a bunch of friends and go, anyone up for this? If so, use this code and you'll end up sat in the same area. So it feels like there's a whole thing that's potential there, which again avoids people having to be on the whole thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's cool. Cool.
There we are. Thanks. Natalia.
Yeah, hi. I was just going to say, so obviously we're from Tickets for Good, so we often see shadow bookers naturally, just because of kind of, our members are the teachers, the charity workers, but we see a lot of people in groups, and we've done a lot of research ourselves with like our community. So NHS workers and things like that often tend to want to go in bigger groups and things like that, as well as taking their family and friends, because they're able to access kind of what we're offering. But we also see quite a few people going solo and often like trying new things. And there's been kind of a big focus on experience and trying things they wouldn't normally access. So I think, a lot of people kind of having experiences and things before are becoming quite big now. And the meetups and kind of the idea of community at events, we're kind of seeing more and more of that happening.
Nice. So when people sign up for Tickets for Good, because obviously I know you a little bit because you're based locally, I've done some work with you, but you can get tickets for a group of people. It's not each individual has to be registered.
Yeah, so the main ticket booker has to attend, and they're the ones who obviously book the tickets and have to have their ID and things like that. But often we have partners who offer, group booking kind of things, so like family tickets and things like that as well.
Yeah, cool. And that's obviously, I'm just going to do a little advert for you. It's a really good way of a wider community with unsold inventory and highly recommended to people. So yes, do talk to Tickets for Good if you have spare tickets and think that'd be good.
Thank you.
They can plan on your behalf, but it's worth it. Annalena has mentioned WhatsApp groups as a whole thing, as to driving ticket booking. And yes, I mean, I keep feeling like that we should be talking more about what the WhatsAppification of engagement and how it enables engagement, because I suspect it's absolutely huge, and it's this sort of weird, I say blind spot. It's not like we don't know it's happening. It's just we have no access to what's going on there. It's just that people then pop up as groups and book things. I think the more we can know about that, the better. I think that would be really interesting. So yes, if anyone's done anything interesting with WhatsApp, please tell me, because I have a little article I want to write based on that as well. And they're posting in the group what seat they've got. That's kind of interesting as well. As Keely has said, you can set up a kind of lock code thing on Spectrix. So that's the whole thing. That sounds brilliant. Yeah, I recommend that. Can you say any more about that, Keely? Have you tried it? Have you just sort of seen it talked through, or? Okay, so use it for guest nights. But yeah, no, I think that's quite an intriguing prospect. And then so you can lock seats and allow codes to open them. Yeah, nice. So Rebecca has said in Hereford, a reserve tickets for a group, you can phone up and book individually, so your seats together. Yes. So I think that's you can often do that as a kind of phone thing, but it's the kind of the automating it, making it easy. I think it's the thing that might make a real difference at scale, potentially. I don't know, maybe other people are happier to phone a box office than I am. I tend to just think, oh, if I can do it on computer, it's all easier. So Jacqui, I noticed you managed not to say anything, just mysteriously in the background.
I was
a shadow speaker, which is a whole other thing. Do you have anything else to say?
Yes, it's all fascinating, and actually, I mean, the shadow audience's questions are, particularly interesting to delve into. But there were some points that came out in your first set of slides, which I found quite interesting around those, particularly the older audiences, and the fact that the data indicates that more than 5 years post the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, some audience behaviours have, they've seen a long-term change in the way that people engage, and we're still seeing that. And it does tend to be with those older audiences who we know were more deeply and significantly impacted by the pandemic in many different ways. And we're seeing that in their engagement, particularly, with those sort of coach groups and things like that, there being fewer of them, people not really engaging in that way anymore. And I thought that was quite interesting. And potentially applies, right across the cultural sector. Those organisations that were perhaps quite heavily dependent on community and culture buffs and home and heritage will have seen quite a steep drop in the people engaging. But the other thing that struck me was that the chart that demonstrated how people had responded to the question about whether they had more or fewer people to attend with, and all of the medium engaged and lower engaged groups identified that they had fewer people to engage with. And the reason that I found that particularly interesting is when we've done barriers research with people, one of the reasons for not attending more that comes up, it's not usually top of the reasons why people don't attend, but it's always in there, fairly near the top, is that people don't, they say, I don't have anyone to go with. And I feel like if people now have, smaller networks, fewer people that they can attend with, that could make that barrier, more significant for them. And that sort of led me into thinking, so what can we do about that? And the idea that organisations that perhaps have something of a sort of social responsibility policy or strategy, whether it would be interesting to think about, or whether organisations already are doing this, building in sort of socialising and networking into their programme, so giving people space, making the sort of invitation for people to come and spend a bit of time in the venue, either before or after an event or performance, for example, to actually, give people the opportunity to build those networks for themselves amongst people who have some sort of shared interest, because they're all, drawn to this particular type of activity. So I wondered whether that was something that organisations were thinking about, whether that's something that would be of interest. So, yeah, I think those were my sort of key thoughts.
Just because there's an interesting discussion happening in the chat as well, so I want to sort of fold that into the room in case people are listening rather than reading. So a point by Katie about people not wanting to have to shell out all the money themselves, particularly given cost of living pressures. It makes me think just more generally, are there ways that arts venues have traditionally been set up that are based on some assumptions about disposable income or availability of income? That, more broadly, I mean, the thing about subscriptions where they exist being a big upfront cost and then spacing it out, or buying for groups, etc. So there could be something quite interesting there about ways of spreading cost, or spreading cost of sort of buy on the day or about the secondary spend type stuff. Might be an interesting thing. But interesting challenge that Annalina's referenced about what you do about so do fees make a difference, how the fee's structured as to how people would choose to book, which is a really good point. But also then I think this came up later, it's possibly, yes, Keely was saying about applying group discounts. Do you know if it's possible to use group discounts if you're using the lock codes? There's a very specific thought or question. Because that's quite interesting, because that would mean that I suppose you could have a system, at least in theory, where the more people that used your lock code, you might get to a point where you get a rebate because you've hit a discount level, which would be quite interesting. So yes. So I don't know if that's true, but that's maybe as and when you next speak to your friendly neighbourhood ticketing supplier. It has to be manual because it doesn't. Yeah, okay. But there we are. That's an interesting question. And yes, socialising being key as a dance organisation. I think in general, when we ask surveys about people about why they attend cultural events, it's essentially a hook for social activity in the main. And so just from an intuitive point of view, it feels to me like understanding the audience relative to that social engagement sort of feels like it probably ought to be really important. Which is more of an intuition than a completely proven point, but it feels like understanding those networks and actually who was there for what, because you get that Spotify Wrapped thing at the end of the year for those who have Spotify, and it goes, you listened to the following this year, and it does hilarious things. Like it told me that I'd listened to lots of electronic Britpop something or other, and it's like, then what happened is that I listened to all of Pulp on repeat. It wasn't a genre, it was Pulp. But anyway, you get that Spotify Wrapped thing, and you can't really do that at a venue because you don't know what people have been to, because all you know is what they booked for. But if you had a thing where you go, actually, we thought you booked for 3 things this year, but actually you came to 10, and here they are, and here are your memories of the year, and aren't we an important part of your life? It's got to be good for loyalty, for fundraising, for communications, for social media and passing the message on, and so forth and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, I think understanding those networks as well, Ollie, it can impact on sort of marketing and messaging strategies as well, and whether you're looking to support people in, as you say, sort of advocacy and word of mouth, and increasing engagement through that route, or whether you're looking at more direct marketing to the people that you do know about. So that deeper understanding, I think, can really help with being very tactical and planning those campaigns.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm aware we're sort of at time, but does anyone else have any other thoughts they want to throw into the mix? Any questions? Any things about what they see with school groups or any others? Any more for any more? What do we think? In which case, apart from being cheeky in the chat, engagement with schools, separate session. Yes, I would, if people are interested in that. And indeed, if people have topics you want us to cover, please let us know. We'll try and make sure we do it. There's this broad question from Annalena. Is it about marketing? Is it about demographics? Is it about both? Which is most important? Schools engagement, more tricky than ever. Okay. We hear you. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming along. I haven't decided what we're talking about next month. So yeah, let me know what you want us to talk about, and then we'll maybe try and talk about that. But also maybe try and bring in some more museumy stuff, more visual arts things as well. So, but thanks very much for coming along. Enjoy the sunny weather. I'm told that it won't necessarily last all the weekend, so enjoy it now. And hopefully see you next month.